Why don't we call this July 8th, 2024 Planning and Zoning meeting to order? And please stand and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance in a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, Paula, can I get a roll call, please?
Commissioner Corey,
Here.
Commissioner DePaul,
Here.
Commissioner Kovacevic,
Here.
Commissioner Schlossberg,
Here.
Commissioner Sevum,
Here.
Vice Chair Watts,
Here.
Chairman Gray.
Here.
Thank you.
And with that, I had this splendid introduction for Phil, but seeing as how he's not here. Sorry, Phil. We'll wait till next time, but nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Paula, do we have any cards for call to the public?
No, Chair.
No speakers. Thank you. Then let's move on to item number 4, consideration of the minutes. I have a motion for approving the minutes. Don't everybody speak up at once.
I'll motion to approve minutes.
I'll second that.
Sounds good. Thank you. And do we have to do a roll call on the minutes or just
No, you could do all in
consensus?
favor.
Right, we're all
Yeah.
in favor, consensus.
Aye.
I didn't hear Phil or Chair Gray regarding the meeting
Aye.
minutes. Okay.
I'll abstain.
Okay. 6-0.
Okay. Okay, so let's go to item number 5, consideration and possible action regarding Ordinance 24-08, amending Chapter 17, wireless telecommunication towers and antenna. All yours, John.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioners, thank you for being here on a hot evening. Just waiting for this PowerPoint. Now it's up here. Let's adjust it here. There it goes. Yes, it is. Feels good. Okay, so as stated, we're here this evening to continue our discussion of proposed changes to Chapter 17 of the zoning ordinance dealing with wireless telecommunication facilities. Just a little background here just to keep the record going. We began the discussion of this topic back in early 2022 when we received some comments, concerns regarding cell towers. Some of the specific concerns expressed were regarding concerns about them catching fire, providing a hierarchy of sites, the spacing and requiring drive tests to document a need for pollution emission insurance, having clear administrative process and shot clocks, concern that we didn't really have proper staff to be able to handle this topic. And both small cell and regular cell towers were part of the discussion. As we continued moving forward from there, council getting involved and folks showing up there expressing some concerns. Focus was more on 5G, and the number of 5G towers that could come into town and possible health impacts from 5G. And then also by May of 2023, we're hearing about concerns for undergrounding of utilities. With all the concerns being expressed, the town council hired Andrew Campanelli to draft an ordinance. We received that ordinance excuse me, last year and was reviewed by staff, and the council had some discussions with Mr. Campanelli on the ordinance. Just a few things from that ordinance. It allowed co-location of small cell wireless facilities in the right-of-way by right, just get a building permit for those. It was silent, didn't say anything about how we would regulate small cell in the right-of-way that required a new pole. Did not address broadband or separate out data services in any way. Did not address or require underground services, and the only NEPA requirements were with regard to initial application review and approval. Following the review with council, council directed staff to continue working on an ordinance based on the things that we had learned. And so that's where we've been since then, beginning at a January meeting of this year, seeking commission and public input on what changes were needed to the code so we know what to focus on. Most of the comments that we'd received related back to broadband service. We continued review in March and April, and you held a public hearing at your May meeting of a draft ordinance. Over the course of these various meetings, we have heard and understand there is concern about our small cell and the right-of-way regulations and a desire to see an increase or updates to that. That's not part of this project right now. It's something the council could direct us to do at some point in the future. And we have heard concerns about and need to make a better distinction between voice and broadband services that's not in our current ordinance. As we have looked at other ordinances, looked at what the consultant provided, we've not really found any direction on how we could do that. In order to do that, if that is a desire of council, they really would need to hire a consultant to bring in and focus on that type of regulation. We've also heard the concern about undergrounding broadband service. Certainly that is the better way to provide the service if it can be done, but that's really a separate topic in terms of how one would go about how the town would initiate that and manage that type of system. So that's, again, that's not really part of what's discussed this evening, but again, it's understood that it's a topic of interest. The goals we have had are to balance the needs for quality service with public safety, limiting towers in or near residential, establishing that clear manageable review process, providing for the maintenance and ongoing compliance, aesthetics, and addressing the concerns that we've heard. So with that bit of a background, we can get into then the ordinance that's evolved from the discussions that we've had. And most of this is going to be the things we've talked about the last few months. There are a few things that I have heard over the last couple of meetings that I've put into the report and we'll discuss this evening about some possible modifications, but a lot of, again, is the same thing that we've been reviewing. So this is the outline, the current ordinance on the left, the proposed outline on the right. So section 1701 sets forth the purpose, intent, and applicability, with subsection A being the purpose. There was some mention at one of the previous meetings that some of the statements in there could maybe be a little stronger. And so I took a stab at doing 4 of those. Instead of saying encourage, promote, instead of minimize, limit, instead of encourage, require, in a couple of statements. Any thoughts, feelings on those? Any others that, amendments that could be made there, comments, questions?
John, I'm personally glad to see changing encourage to require. I think that strengthens it a lot, so I appreciate that.
Okay. Moving on to B, about the intent. It includes a 4-part balancing test in there. There were some comments and questions about that test and how it is used. It's really a test of the ordinance itself, letting anybody in the industry that's looking at this know what went into drafting the ordinance and what we were trying to do and accomplish with the ordinance. And so the 4-part test really applies to looking at the ordinance itself, and is it doing the things it says, enabling the services, minimizing the towers, minimizing impacts, and complying with the TCA. And we feel it does those things. And then next part of 1701 is applicability. The first parts of that are just moving from another portion of the code with current requirements. There are a couple of additional sections that's been in there since we began. One was because of the separation of the different elements of our wireless communication ordinance, having the small cell and right-of-way in a different location, we added that statement in here so anybody looking in this ordinance would know where to look for the small cell and right-of-way. And then we've also had some questions over time about what are often called CALs, cells on wheels. When you have special events or you have outages in some places, or they're changing out a tower, and then you bring in the temporary on wheels tower, you don't have any regulations for those, so we've added some of that in here. The first one being that if it's for 7 days or less, you just basically can do it. It's things that are longer than that would require any further review. From there, we move into section 1702, definition section. We've proposed to add 3 additional definitions to what is in the current ordinance. One is for utility service antennas. These are those little antennas you'll see on utility boxes around some places. There's one out here off of Law, Montana by the bus stop. Those types of things have been cropping up lately as the utilities put in communication devices between different boxes to flip switches and turn on and off valves and those types of things. And so we didn't really have those covered in any way in our ordinance. So we've added that language in here. It starts with this definition. And then just basic definition of what we mean by wireless communication and wireless facility. Those weren't in the current ordinance. Going on from there, we move into section 1703, which is a general requirements section. And so this provides this kind of overall list of the types of things that we typically need to see and review with regard to different types of cell tower applications. They're not all required in every case, but gives an overall view of what we're looking for. And so again, here's a list, not comprehensive, but some of the main things that are covered in this particular section. In the current ordinance, we did add some more details with regard to aesthetics than what's in the current ordinance to try to minimize those adverse impacts and the views that might happen with cell towers. And again, a section on utility service antennas, because that's a new piece.
Do you want comments now, or do you want them later?
Now's fine with me if it's okay with the chairman.
So we were given 8 model ordinances, for lack of a better term. A number of the other ordinances required monopole towers and prohibited lattice towers, and also required stealth technology. And I don't see where we've made that restriction. Is that intentional, or is that, then why, if not, why not?
Vice Chair, Commissioner Kovacevic, so we haven't taken the step of monopoles. I think we could. I think that's what we're most likely going to see anyway. But if we could look at a place to add the monopoles. Most of the aesthetic design criteria in here are getting towards making it stealth by hiding it, disguising it. Again, maybe that could be a little bit stronger, but that's the intent of a lot of these aesthetic standards. They just didn't use the word stealth anywhere.
You have a question, Patrick?
Well, John, I noticed this letter that you sent to us today addressed a lot in regards to Section 1703. What are your thoughts on some of these federal requirements that is mentioned here?
Vice Chair, Commissioner DePauw, I'll make a brief comment now. I'll put a slide at the end to kind of cover it a little bit more comprehensively. But with regard to this particular piece, all the standards we pulled in here were from the consultant's draft that they sent us. And again, that's a professional in the field who's worked these kind of ordinances elsewhere, so we feel pretty confident that they ought to be appropriate and ought to be within the law. It's something, given this comment, we will go back and review with our attorney just to make sure, but I think we're pretty comfortable.
And John, a couple of questions, and a couple of them may go back a little bit, but can you define stealth? What does that mean? I mean, camouflage is one thing, impersonating a cactus is another. What is stealth?
If you're asking me.
Yes.
Vice Chair, to me, stealth and camouflage are the same things. You're trying to hide it so it's not as obvious that it's there.
Because I think that I'm not sure if it's the Vulcans or the Romulans have stealth technology. I didn't know if we were incorporating that or not. Another one is how many providers can be on every tower? And along those lines, is the output accretive? Do we look at it from that perspective, or do we look at it in a singularity?
So, Chairman, with regard to the first question, I think it would come down to the design of the pole and what it was designed to hold in terms of the number of providers that can go on there. Technologies also evolve a little bit, and so it may change. Mostly we've seen antennas get smaller, more compact, but not always. Sometimes they are bigger. And so it may, again, those things may affect the ultimate number of providers that can go on a pole. And with regard to your second question, which I couldn't repeat exactly because I don't remember exactly how you said it, but again, it gets into a level of technology that I probably can't really answer.
Well, I think it's something to consider because if everything has, if it's linear and something has an output of 50, whatever that might be, 50 decibels, 85 decibels, but if you have 4 and the accumulation is based on the 85, 340, is that something that we should manage to make sure that the accretive output isn't past what the FCC regulations are?
And again, I really can't answer that question. The tests that are done of the RF radiation from the antennas, I don't know if that gets into a cumulative or if it really is something that just measures the individual outputs.
The testing devices that I've looked at in kind of preparation for this look at the output in total, but I don't know that everyone has a different frequency. So I'm not positive, but I think it's something we ought to look into to make sure. And my last question is, there's an electrical meter on the site. Do you know what the ampacity of that electrical meter is? Is it, because that would have some limiting effect on the number of providers as well because of the amount of equipment?
Chairman, no, I don't. I would think that would be, again, as I think through the things I've seen in ordinances and what's in our ordinances, the emphasis has always been on the tower itself and what it can hold and the engineering structure there. The equipment base at the bottom has been less of a concern and gets updated and changed around as needed to handle the towers that are on the pole. And so I think they would make that kind of change as needed based on the providers on the tower.
I still think that we have some responsibility to look at the size of the disconnect, if it's going to be a 100 amp disconnect, 200 amp, 400 amp, some size, because the primary conductors are going to have to be installed initially by the utility, and the conduit sizes would have to be sized appropriately for the conductors. So we wouldn't want to be tearing up streets again, particularly if we're going to go eventually look at streets. So I think that's something, I know we've talked about it in the building codes, about how large they are, what their requirements are, phasing and that sort of thing. So I think we should at least address that and give some consideration.
So just make sure I understand, Vice Chair, that if we look at some of the places in the code where we talk about the co-location, in addition to the engineering of the tower, if we put in a requirement that they provide service up front capable for the multiple carriers, so that it doesn't require that rework. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, if originally we put in a 100 amp disconnect, and that is sufficient to support 4 co-located providers, we wouldn't want to put 8 on there and then have to go back and reinvent the wheel for that particular application.
Or on the other hand, if we didn't pay attention to that up front, and so we let them put in 50 amp to start with, and it can't support any additional providers, and they say, oops, sorry, we can't co-locate because we didn't put in enough service to start with. We don't want to limit ourselves in that way either, so make sure they put in sufficient
That's
at the
correct.
beginning to cover 2 or 3 or whatever.
Correct, thank you.
Okay. Ready to go on? Okay.
Yeah, just what I saw in the ordinances, what they didn't deal with electrical supply, except to say it had to be underground. But what it did say, a new pole would have to be able to handle at least 3 co-located facilities.
So moving on then with some of the general requirements. Again, we've had some discussions about this along the way. We've added some language, more than what's in the current code with regard to, at the time of submission, information about the noise and providing the acoustical information with the initial application, and that we can require noise baffling. And then also the engineering certificates, certifications, excuse me, have been moved to this section of the code. Setbacks in 1703B has information about setbacks of towers to different land uses, and also separations between towers. At the last, so in the current code, the most restrictive is 200 feet from habitated residential use, single family, to a tower, or I think it's 300% of the height of the tower. And then from there, they kind of shrink down to not being a specific separation requirement from industrial. There was a comment at the last meeting in May that we ought to increase those numbers. And what I got from reviewing it was 500 feet should be the standard for all residential. And then also to increase the separation between towers. I haven't changed anything in the ordinance yet at this point. I felt it needed some further discussion because it was just one comment, but did take a look at what those numbers might mean. It might be kind of hard to read all that map, but basically the areas in blue are areas that are at least 500 feet away from any residential use of any kind, with one error, and that was, I don't know if that's going to work. You try the mouse. This piece right here shouldn't be on there because that's within 500 feet of a residential use. And then from there, if we look at where there are existing towers and apply the separation requirements, it gives us just a few locations where a new tower could go without required council review.
The old, the old ordinance was 300 feet?
200 feet or 300% of the height of the tower. And that was just for single-family residential. If it's multifamily or if it's zoned residential but not built yet, just platted, those numbers start to reduce a little bit, that type of thing.
And why would we, if it's vacant, unplatted, but zoned residential, why would we reduce the setback if it's somebody's gonna live there someday?
Again, I didn't draft the ordinance, but I assume the idea was if the tower's gone there first and then you're platting it, you'll plat it with that in mind and adjust your plat, or people then that are buying the lots will know that the tower's there and will make that decision rather than the other way around with the homes being there first.
Okay. Commissioner Corey?
John, so this map is with the 500 feet?
Right.
Did you see a map that was with the 300? Did it change that much?
Vice Chair, Commissioner, I knew someone would ask me that question, but no, we didn't, because the current setup is it has different numbers based on whether it's zoned and platted or it's vacant, and there's just too many iterations of that to try to put that one together to show all the variations. And so we just did this to show the impact of what 500 feet would be.
And John, I'd suggest including the word minimum of 500. I wouldn't want it to be any less, and I don't think there should be much in the way of discretion to make it less, so minimum should be preceding 500. And the other question is, that goes back to the noise. I'm not really sure how much noise these make, but wouldn't it be prudent to say that they should all have acoustical enclosures?
They'll all have the screen walls around them, block walls around them as a minimum.
I'm thinking more of if you walk by a gen set or any kind of electronic device, there's a buzzing that goes on, and I'd like to see that contained as well. So an acoustical enclosure, I would recommend adding that as a requirement. Okay.
I'd also like to add the old ordinance had a 50 decibel limit at the property line, and I'm in favor of that. I think that the noise section here is just, it's too squishy. It can mean whatever anybody wants it to mean.
Looks like I got two of the same here by mistake. And again, commissioners, we can make that kind of change if you would like. And the last time that the town reviewed and updated our noise ordinance with input from our town prosecutor, he strongly advised against using decibels because they're just so difficult to enforce ultimately. And so we've taken them out everywhere else in the code, but if you'd like to put it back, we can certainly add that in here. So I want to go to this table then for just a moment, if we could, and see what consensus.
Well, before we move off of decibels, though, I would like to affirm that there's a consistency with this type of decibel output noise. There's an inconsistency with everything else that we try to measure as decibels, and I believe the argument is still valid but people can be loud, there can be parties going on, and so on. So I kind of understand where it's difficult to measure based on decibels. But in this particular case, because of the consistency of the equipment's operation, the decibel output is going to be consistent and not inconsistent. So I think we should have it in there.
So is that consensus?
Are we okay?
I think so, but if I can just ask a question, just for my clarification, where are we hearing this noise? What kind of tower or box would I have walked past sometime in walking around Fountain Hills? Like, where am I hearing this? Where does the noise come from?
It comes from the electronic devices that, I mean, there's transformers, there's rectification circuits, there's all sorts of things that can generate noise. And if you don't at least limit the amount of noise to Commissioner Kovacevic's point,
Yeah.
which is 50 decibels, then you could crank up that power and make it more annoying. Because there are certain times when a transformer, for instance, buzzes. And it is extremely annoying, even in a mechanical room, as Commissioner DuPont can tell you. You walk by and you may not hear it at certain times, but you can at other times when there's a load on that particular transformer, for instance.
So we're being like more proactive about
Yes,
this?
absolutely.
Versus that it wasn't complaint driven or something that somebody said, we've heard a loud one around town?
It's experience driven.
Okay.
I can attest to it. I've got Patrick's head going like this, says
Okay.
yes. Everybody knows that there is noise generated by electrical devices, including transformers. So that 50 decibels at the property line makes a lot of sense, and hence the acoustical enclosure as well.
Jared, think about what you just said in terms of at the property line, and I guess we would want to be clear, is it at the property line or is it outside the enclosure screen wall? How far away do we really want to be? Because sometimes, and I guess it really, maybe should be at the property line, because you can't hear it. If it's loud on the property, then maybe that's not an issue.
The more restrictive one would be outside the enclosure. So if we have an acoustical enclosure, that's going to dampen it somewhat. But even acoustical enclosures are designed for a certain decibel containment. So I would say if we were outside the immediate enclosure, that's where I would like to see it. That would be as quiet as you can get it.
Okay. Is that
We okay?
we go down then to the table on the setbacks. So again, Vice Chair, what I heard, at least for these top few, or maybe it's for all the residential ones here, you'd like to see all those be at least 500 feet?
How does this table compare to the one that I just saw that had 1,500 feet?
So this is separation between towers.
Okay, so go back, thank you. Residences, right? Yes, that's the one that I'd like to see a minimum of 500 feet.
This works a little bit backwards on itself, but basically it says up here in 2 that, maybe it's up here in 1, that in the table of the setbacks you have to follow, council may reduce those, which basically says then that kicks you into that public review in order to have something that's less than 500 feet away.
So it's sorry.
Go, Commissioner Corey.
Thank you. So what you're saying here is because it's less, it's 100 feet, that gives more flexibility to have that meeting with the residents.
So I'm saying it's the way it's worded currently, because it can kick it to council. By putting the 500 feet in here, you're not saying you'll never get one within 500 feet of a residence. It just means that in order to do it within 500 feet of any residentially zoned property or used property, it would have to go to council for review.
Whereas right now, it's within 100
Right now, it's 300 feet.
300 feet.
Anything closer than 300 feet has to go to council.
Is that what you're looking for?
That's exactly what I'm looking for. To maximize the distance, and I don't think there's any way to prohibit anybody who doesn't like the 500 feet to go and petition council for an exception or a variance. I think a variance is a natural thing to do, but I think that the council members need to understand the implication of making it any closer than 500 feet or allowing it any closer. So variances should be non-existent as far as I'm concerned.
You're using the term variances. To me, that means it's going to Board of Adjustment. So I'm not sure you mean variance.
Well, you said town council, and I interpret that as variance, so my bad. I would go to council and hope that they don't approve it.
So public review process for anything under 500 feet. And so basically, well, let me ask this other question then, in terms of the non-residentially zoned piece, is it 500 feet there also, or is that none, like it has been? If we're trying to encourage them to go in non-residentially zoned property, if you have to be 500 feet from residential and 500 feet away from everything else, then everything's going to require a special use permit, and we might as well just say that up front.
Commissioner
I
Kovacs?
guess that's my,
And that's fine if that's what the council,
that was
if that's
my,
what you want to do.
that was my takeaway from this. In all 8 of the model ordinances, there was a public process. They weren't all necessarily through Plan Commission and Town Council from the various municipalities. But there were only even 1 or 2 that just said, okay, you've got to notify everybody within 750 feet of the tower or everybody within 1,000 feet of the tower, that all the residents. But in 6 of the 8, it was conditional use permits, special use permits. It was, and I would say probably 4 of the 8, it was Plan Commission, Town Council to get approval. And so I am coming down on the side of everything's a special use permit.
Chair, I concur with Commissioner Kovacevic.
What's that do to us, John, as far as everything we've got outlined already? I mean, are these the guidelines, but it still requires a special use permit?
So the way it's drafted today, I'll stay here, that is shown really starting here in terms of the types of applications. So today we have administratives, which are mostly modifications to existing towers, but it does allow for new towers if they meet the separation requirements. But if we're getting rid of any separation requirements for new towers, so that piece would go away. Or it's at least going to change to 500 feet, it seems like. And then, so the public review would be for all new towers and any modifications to existing towers that exceed the limits that are described in the section on the administrative review.
So we've eliminated all of the administrative review process if we eliminate the table within 500 feet.
For new towers.
For new towers, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
But are we? I mean, we still have to give the tower builder a set of design criteria. And that is part of the design criteria. You have to be 500 feet from the property line, if that's, where we're coming down on this. I don't think that the table goes away. I think the table has to be in there, and just that's part of what the design, what the builder has to hit, or the permittee has to hit.
So, Chair, Commissioner, just to make sure I'm clear on that. So that sounds like you're saying that if you are less than 500 feet away from any residential use of any kind, you just can't go in. And then if you're beyond that, then you can apply for a special use permit. Is that what you were suggesting?
No. I'm not saying you can't go in, but if you come in at less than 500 feet, your application is less likely to be approved. That you're not, you won't, you're swimming upstream in a big way. I mean, because who knows if if we need the tower, we should have the flexibility to do the tower, but it should be part of the criteria that we're, I think 500 feet. Again, if that's what we've decided, I mean, I think Paradise Valley, which is built up, is 300. And so at some point, at 300, I would say absolutely. If they're not less than 300, they shouldn't come in. But hard and fast, I don't know how hard and fast it has to be. I mean, they could come in for for lack of a better word, a variance.
So, I'm not sure which direction I want to go, but I'll point out this one page that was coming up next on the slides, and that's in terms of a hierarchy of sites is another way to approach this, either in conjunction with or instead of. Because it sounds like at least some of what you're trying to do is direct them to be as far away from residential as possible. And so if that's what we want, then we should make it maybe as easy as possible to go where you really want them. But a minute ago we were saying everything should have a special use permit, then it really doesn't matter whether you're applying in a residential or commercial, you're gonna have to go through the special use permit. So again, maybe it's this hierarchy of sites criteria where you've got to, if you're trying to go in a residential area, you've really got to justify why you're going there versus the ones we really give a priority to in the industrial areas or the commercial areas.
John, why couldn't we do both? Why couldn't we say, in order to apply for a special use permit, you have to meet these minimum conditions, that 500-foot threshold? I mean, I think it effectively does the same thing that Commissioner Kovacevic says is what we're trying to do. It's not an either or, it has to be. We've given them design specifications that if you want to apply, which you are required to do, consider the fact that at a minimum, you have to be 500 feet.
And we could do that. But
Okay.
again, when we do that, the blue areas on the map are the only places that are left. And within those blue areas, some of them aren't available at all because of the existing towers that are already there. So it leaves you a spot in there, leaves you a spot right there. It leaves you this area, which it probably wouldn't happen in. You got a lake in the Plateau 8 area that's already developed. It leaves you these two places. And those are the only areas in town then that meet that initial criteria of 500 feet away and are separated from existing towers. And then within those areas, you'd have to apply for a special use permit. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Now, that makes sense to me. Do we have a consensus on that? We okay with it? Sure. Patrick? We're good.
Could I ask a question?
Sure. That sounds like Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. I guess and I'm not an expert by any stretch with this, I just got into it, but what's the rationale between 300 and 500? I mean, is there scientific rationale with it that it minimizes this health risk? It has an impact on valuations of property. I mean, where is the specific advantage between 300 and 500 feet?
I think, because I'm not getting John to cooperate by answering for me, I think the issue is both property values, health and welfare, because we still don't know for sure the governance of the accretiveness of an output on a particular tower. So if we design for 4 providers and we end up with 6 or 8, are they same frequency, complementary frequencies? So I think it has an effect, potentially has an effect on both property values and health and safety. The closer you are to this, if you can envision a cloud coming off of the output part of the antenna, there's a stream, there's a cone or a stream, a cloud in some fashion, and it has the potential to have a problem that cause health problems. On the other side, there is a physical component of I think it's a 3 by 3 by 4 base with a tower with a monopole on top of it that could potentially be in somebody's front yard, and that has a detrimental effect on the property values. So both of those things can be considered as potentially detrimental, and that's what we were trying to avoid, or to minimize the opportunity for any tower to go in anywhere. Does that help, Phil?
Yeah, it does. It sounds like it's just to minimize whatever impacts there might be.
Correct.
The impacts really they're not specific right now. We obviously in general they are, but this is a way to try to minimize that impact.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Chair,
Go ahead, Patrick.
so 500 feet, does that sound like something that, will pass? I mean, what are other municipalities doing? What's Paradise Valley? You see, I think you mentioned 300, and,
Paradise was the shortest distance at 300. Then there were a number at 500. So, and then some of them are silent. Some of them, like John was pointing out, this preferential site criteria, which doesn't really give you a distance. So, I mean, everybody's all over the board.
okay.
But the numbers that I've looked at, the number of ordinances, and it's north of 8, they have been 500 or better. 500 is the minimum, and it looks like we've mitigated some of the potential problems by the areas in blue, as John's outlined, by having it 500 feet.
Okay. Along with, trying to control sound and all that, all these requirements, like 500 seems pretty reasonable then.
Yeah, I'd like 1,500, but we're not going to get it.
Okay, so again, what I heard that you want to see in the ordinance is a criteria that any new towers have to be at least 500 feet away from any residentially zoned or used property as a minimum to then be able to continue on to get a special use permit through the town council.
Correct. Chairman Gray, comments?
No, I mean, I'm with you. 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. I don't really care for any of this. So if we think 500 is on par with peers, it's not an outlier, right? That's what we have to avoid in these scenarios is we can't be, we can't have such a tremendous outlier that it's dismissed. Then I'm good with 500.
Thank you.
Vice Chair, and Chair Gray, I don't have those other ordinances in front of me right now. What I think I recall from them, however, is that you could still apply for a conditional use permit in those other areas within the towns. It just had that limit on where you could go without having to apply. So I don't think in those other towns there's a total prohibition of any place else in town that didn't meet that criteria.
I don't really want to belabor all this that much anymore, but I kind of view this as kind of the same, or my way of thinking, right? So I view this as, why is this any different than how liquor licenses are apportioned in places? We can say, yeah, you can put a tower here and that tower can have, 2 antennas on it. I don't really care whose antennas they are or the diversity of those antennas, but, there's limitations there. And if the next provider is willing to lease that antenna at a higher premium, let it, let it be transactional. I don't know that we should open up, capacity necessarily, on private property.
Moving on.
Please.
Okay. So moving on in section 703, or 1703, next section C talks about buildings and other equipment. Basically, this addresses some things about the equipment cabinets and how they relate in a couple of different settings. Co-location. So this is moved from another portion of the code. There are no changes, but again, it kind of outlines some of the requirements, mostly that new towers, again, designed to accommodate future co-location, requirement that people cooperate with that, third-party review if there is a conflict. Got a typo there, no location required if it results in significant interference, and people that fail to comply, it would result in denial or revocation. So again, this would be a place where I can come and look for some additional statements about the tower being designed initially, not only in terms of its structural, but its electrical capacities to handle multiple co-locations. Not sure if it'll be in here or if it'll be someplace else, but that's one of the places I would look to include that.
And John, how do we validate whether there's significant interference? What measurement? Because it's a great statement, but there has to be a process.
Where am I in the code here? Maybe I'm too far past it already.
Is this going to the third-party testing?
It's up here. So it's number 4 on the list here. It's actual wording.
I hate to belabor this, but that doesn't really answer the question. What constitutes significant interference? And there has to be a measurement, something that some standard that we can apply to that.
So again, we could probably push that back to some of the third-party review to verify that there is going to be interference. But I couldn't tell you, standing here today, what those criteria would be.
Maybe you just said it, though. Maybe it is the engineer's report that at the time that it's submitted, that they've done the testing in the area and there wouldn't be any, so a validation by the electrical engineer or PE, somebody that can do that. I think we should include something to get some verification. It's too ambiguous otherwise.
Okay. Then we get into the actual types of applications. And so there are 2 types, the administrative and public review. And administrative, at this point, as they're drafted, really are the modifications occurring to existing towers, and describes then those types of changes that would be allowed, how much you can increase the size and so forth of towers. And then public review, again, this was set at 300 feet, but now we're saying we'll change that to the 500 feet and requiring the special use permit. And then from there, we move into the actual processing of applications. So the initial part is very much like we've done in the Section 202 changes of the zoning ordinance with other applications in terms of what the basic submittal statement and process is. Then there were all the things reviewed in 1703 in terms of general requirements. And so if they apply to a particular type of application, they need to provide that. You've got to provide the inventory of existing sites. And then also provide some specific criteria for the utility service antenna, because they are a little bit different. And then we go through the actual rest of the process here. There's some requirements for existing towers and proposed towers, and we've added in the photo simulations of the new tower, and you pay the fee. Have a section that's been added in terms of shot clocks. It's one of the things that there's concern about. There are some specific standards from FCC rules, and so I've added extensive language on how the shot clocks are worked and what starts and stops those shot clocks, so that we don't get something approved just because we didn't act in a timely fashion on it. And again, it goes through then the actual processing with the different bodies. And so the public review is the same as for special use permit. And we've added in the requirement as council request for the drive test. And the council may approve conditions on the approval. Oops. Section on removal of abandoned towers, it's the same as the current ordinance. And then the federal and state requirements. The initial paragraph there is one that's been in the code for a while, but we added the paragraphs on the initial certification of RF compliance within 45 days, and the opportunity then for the town to request the random ongoing test, and the penalties involved if somebody is in non-compliance. And then staying in compliance with the building codes, and staying in compliance with the noise ordinance. And then the last section is 1707. There's really no change except for a few section numbers, references. So as mentioned earlier by Commissioner DePaul, we did receive today a letter from CTIA. And I'd have to look over there again and remember what CTIA stands for, but it's a wireless communication advocacy lobbying group of some kind. They questioned some sections of the draft ordinance, had some concerns with them. And so the ones listed here, and Commissioner Paul, the ones you brought up before, are all sections pulled pretty much directly from what our previous consultant had drafted. And so at least in general, we feel confident with those that they would be in compliance with the rules. The one that they highlighted with regard to the new utility service antennas, we've been working with SRP on what those standards would be. They are comfortable with them. And so, again, we feel pretty confident that we're not going to have any of the utilities pushing back on that. They pointed out the section saying no signs. I know as a zoning administrator that means some kind of commercial sign. It doesn't mean you can't put up any required signs. But we could modify that language a little bit just to make sure that's clear, that any required signs can be there. That's no issue to make that change. A couple other sections that they questioned are in the current ordinance and just being repeated. They've been there, again, been used for a long time. Again, we're comfortable with those. And then the language they questioned in 1705C. That's some of the review criteria with regard to the process. I mostly just disagree with them. I think the language is fine and is clear enough for this type of review. Let's see if I can. I've gone past it here.
Commissioner Corey?
Just two things. One, previously you mentioned the drive test to verify gaps in coverage. Right. And I'm just curious, like what happens if there is a gap? What's the, how do we correct that?
Sure. So Vice Chair and Commissioner Corey, usually when tower companies in here promoting and applying for new facilities, it's because they believe that there is a gap in service. They get so many customers complaining, I just don't get service here. And so I need to put in a new tower. That's the only way to provide our customers with reasonable and consistent access to the network. And they usually provide some type of heat map that they've generated just from their computers that show where the gaps are. And so this is a step beyond that and requiring them to drive the streets with some meters that actually register the amount of signal being received and produce that in a document for us to look at and verify where there really are gaps in their service where people can't get the service they need.
And okay, so if they put a tower in and then we find out, oh, there's still gaps in certain areas, how do they correct that? Do they change the tower or do they move the tower?
Not going to move a tower.
Well, I mean, plan on locating it somewhere else.
So
I
they
mean,
might add more towers if that's the case.
okay.
But hopefully when that comes in, we look at the gap and where it is and what they're designing, that they are really filling in
Okay.
all the gap.
I'm just mentioning that because, you know, we're being restrictive for the right reasons. But if we find that there's a gap later on or when they're installing it, then it sounds like we need to be kind of flexible in working with them so that they can put it in the right spot or have the right coverage broadcast, right?
I think the issue is validation that there's a gap, because coverage can be because of capacity, it can be because of frequency, it can be because of output, it can be even reduced frequency and output. So I think generally speaking, most of the providers would, I'm going to use a non-technical term, crank up the power in order to cover the gap.
It's very technical.
We don't, right, so we don't want that. We want validation, and I think we ought to have a way to capture that validation, have the file, the data that says, here's the gap, here's the bell curve, here's where the time of day over a period of time to validate that there actually is a gap, rather than just wholesale say, add a tower, or you can crank it up a little bit because you're within the confines of what the FCC says is okay. So I'd like to have something more definitive in there about how do we determine and validate that there are gaps? And maybe that's a third party, you know, a non-biased third party that is going to collect that data and or review the provider's data so they make their records available so we can do that. We want to help them, but we don't want to give them carte blanche to just do whatever they need to do to increase coverage.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, like we were talking about at the beginning of this meeting briefly, was down during the 4th of July, I was down at the fountain watching the fireworks and there was no coverage. I couldn't send text messages, it wasn't going through. And I think it's probably because there's a lot of people down there at one time using the bandwidth, but maybe that's an opportunity where they can crank it, what was it, crank it up or something? You know, to be able to provide.
That's an opportunity for cows or, you know, temp facilities that clearly was missed by the provider.
Yeah.
Regardless, I think it needs to be validated, and we need to come up with a way to validate by collecting the data, analyzing that data, looking at when the capacity or lack of capacity occurs in order to substantiate adding a tower, because most likely it's going to be adding a tower, not cranking it up. Yeah. At that point, they probably cranked it up.
Yeah. And
Chair, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just my last note. So it was interesting to read the CTIA feedback, and my only major concern here, John, is they brought up multiple examples where this ordinance is inconsistent with federal laws. So that would be my major concern here, is I know you said you're going to review it with the attorney just to make sure that we're doing everything right. We don't want to, you know, get in trouble for something here. So that's my recommendation, is to just take it back to the attorney and make sure that we're following the laws here.
To add to that, and sorry to cut you off, Chairman Gray. When we started on community housing, we were told you can't, you can't, you can't. You can't, it's restricted, you can't do this, you can't do that. And if we take a word of a lobbyist or our attorney and say that you can't do something that we successfully have done with community housing, then we are being remiss. And I think it's incumbent on us to make an aggressive, protective ordinance, not prohibit, but manage the implementation and serviceability of anything we allow in the town based on this ordinance.
But just to review it with them, make sure.
With the concept of reviewing is not acquiescing to what somebody doesn't want to get sued for. Back to you, Commissioner, Chairman Gray.
And I'm sorry, Commissioner Corey, there's a delay and I keep jumping on top and I don't mean to do that. So I promise I won't do it again. I want to go back to the conversation about heat mapping and, doing that sort of study, that gap analysis study. Maybe I'm wrong here, but I almost want to say what we ought to write into our ordinance is not something that's on the solicitation side, but something that's on the closeout side. So you put up a tower, we have, third-party commissioning, or, the town is a part of that commissioning process. We validate that the tower's outputs are, where they're supposed to be per code and per FCC regs. And the heat map is a part of the closeout and the commissioning process of that tower, so that we have that baseline, because that to me is more valuable at that point, where we can say, let me say this differently. If we don't have it there, then when a gap is identified, the power is getting cranked. And I think Commissioner Watts, you essentially said that. Whereas, if we see a gap closure, it's kind of a trigger for the municipality to say, hey, something's changed here. Somebody's changed a parameter and cranked up the output here, and we need to dig into this a little bit. So I'd like to see that language on the commissioning side of a tower's installation versus on the application side, because I don't understand how you heat map. I guess you could do it, but it's a lot harder to heat map something, before you're actually generating the signal. And I think if we are going to ask for it on the application side, then really what we're saying is similar to the way, wind turbines are surveyed on ridge lines. We're saying go out and put up, a temp tower, beam the signal, heat map it, and report back. And I just don't think that that's something that's ever going to come to fruition.
So, Chair, if I may, so the drive test is going out and testing the infrastructure that's in place now, and by doing that testing, documenting that, in fact, there is a gap in service. So that then justifies the need for the additional tower.
John, I think that's where I disagree, because based upon the timing, there could be an insufficient capacity, or there could be a reduced output. There's some variables, a lot of variables, that could be applicable to why coverage isn't available at that point in time. Could be interference by the fireworks.
Yeah, surge of people.
You just don't know. So you need some validation again as to why, some justification, and a commissioning process is pretty much industry standard. Whether it's in the telecom industry, whether it's in the mechanical industry, commissioning is an important part of making sure everything is installed the way it was designed and the way it was presented by the engineer.
Sure, yeah, I can see adding that other piece in too, but I was just trying to cover the difference in what they were doing.
Okay.
But that's if the town actually invests in a third-party commissioning process, right? Because
That's going to be on the provider.
that's going to be on the provider, okay?
The provider, and then we can look at it and see if the data is valid, if there's any loopholes in the data.
Okay. I would think that the town would also have someone that can look out for the town on this matter, just to ensure.
I would say, I'd agree ideally that if we had somebody that was certified, because you need the certification to read the data and to use your own, it's not an oscilloscope, it's a spectrometer, I believe, that you have to look at and see what the frequencies are, what the volumes are, and then compare that to the provider's data. That's where the bell chart comes in, when you show time of day and how much usage and capacity, what you've got, what you projected, that it's all consistent. So I think I'd love to see that included, that we would have somebody on staff. I don't know if we're going to get that through because of the training and the certifications.
Yeah.
But certainly can't hurt to ask. In-house certification. Go ahead, Commissioner Coates.
or have you gotten through?
Yes.
Okay. I made a list of things that I think were at least that were in other ordinances that we haven't addressed in ours. So I would like to go through that. We talked about the public process and getting an SUP. We talked about monopole towers using stealth technology. One of the ordinance stipulated no RF emissions below 8.5 feet above grade. Is that something that would make sense for us? Okay. We talked about the old noise limits. We talked about setbacks. We talked about holding the setbacks even if the zoning's vacant and unplatted at 500 feet, right?
Yes.
Okay. The new towers must provide for co-location, and one of they usually specified at least one. One of them said a new tower has to be able to co-locate 3 additional users. Do we want to specify that? I know we talked about you reviewing the power and the downside of that from health, safety, and welfare, but.
Are you asking to put that in the ordinance that?
I'm throwing it out there, yeah.
Every design has to be able to support at a minimum 3, 4 providers?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm suggesting, I'm throwing it out there for discussion. We can go through them all, or we can go through them one at a time and get feedback.
What's the value in stipulating the number of providers per tower?
I think you get, like in the case of adding 3, you get a lot of use out of that tower. Yeah, I mean, you're specifying.
Did you put a maximum on it too then? Because then we go back to the electrical requirements for the different providers.
I don't know. What I did was I went through the ordinances that were provided to us, and I pulled out what the other towns did. I don't know any more about how a tower works today than I did a year ago, but I know what's in these ordinances.
Okay.
Chair and Commissioner, another thing we have to be concerned about there a little bit at some point is it often gets harder to be stealth or camouflaged as you add more and more antennas on, more providers on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think depending upon the design that you start with and where it's at and what you're trying to do, that can be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even adding the second one.
Yeah, that sounds right. I don't know how you do it. But co-location seems to be pretty standard, the requirement of providing co-location. And like if these things are gonna look like palm trees, I would guess you could co-locate.
Palm trees in the desert.
Yeah.
So right, if we're going to do that, I think this would be the place right here where we could add a number.
Mm-hmm.
Shall be designed to accommodate at least 2 or 3 more antenna, whatever number we want to put in there, rather than just leave it open, if that's the desire of the commission.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's a tough one because I don't know, to one of my original questions, are the outputs accretive or parallel? And I think we need some technical input to be able to answer that question. I'm not sure. Because I think as long as if you design it initially to say, I can have 4 providers on the same tower based on co-location, but I can't exceed 6 providers. There needs to also be a basis why you can't exceed the 6. So I do think we need some more input on that, a little bit more research.
Okay, so I don't know if this would be a time to remind the commission. I'm going to use it as a time to remind the commission. You talked about it at your May meeting. You held your public hearing. 90 days to make your recommendation to council. So that has to happen before your next meeting. So if we can't make a recommendation tonight, you'll need to schedule a special meeting between now and your August meeting to finish up.
Okay.
I don't want the fear of a special meeting
Yeah,
to
I'm not,
deter us either.
I'm here.
So In your research, how many towers, or how many providers on a tower have you seen kind of universally?
Most of they all ask for co-location.
Right.
Some of them specify one. The most I saw was 3.
Okay.
Can I
Okay, go ahead.
go on?
Yeah, please.
Okay, there's security, one of the towns asked for security for the maintenance of the paint and the maintenance of the landscaping around the tower. So they provide a bond that covers 2 years of maintenance of the landscaping. I don't know if that's something we want to talk about. One of the towns, or most of the towns, ask for security for the removal of the tower if it's abandoned. And that typically is a reservation of lien rights. They don't require that you put up, a letter of credit or a bond or anything. It's just, if we have to remove the tower, we have lien rights on the property. One of the towns requires annual RF testing at permittee expense. I know that the trade group said that they felt that was that was the FCC's realm and not ours, but one of the towns didn't seem to care about that. The building, we say they got to comply with our building code. Do we have a building code for towers?
I don't know if there's a specific tower building code, but there are electrical codes and structural requirements for it.
Because they name ANSI, ANSI, and some of the towns name who provides those kind of standards. The fiber optics and the power to these towers and from these towers is underground. I think that should be specified.
That's already in our codes.
Okay. It was the California ordinances, they required a backup power supply. Is that something we would want?
Possibly, but it's my understanding FCC is requiring that in most cases anyway.
Okay.
So we have,
I don't know. I didn't look at the FCC, what the FCC requires. And I noticed that it was in the California ordinances and it was not in the Arizona ordinances, but a backup power supply. We need to make a statement that the paint, color, and finish must be maintained in a good condition at all times, and graffiti needs to be removed within 48 hours. I think we need to have that kind of language in there. Testing at permittee expense for interference, structural, or electrical integrity, if it's ever in question, that we have the right to test. And I think some of them limited it to once a year, but we would have we should get the right to test if there is interference, if there's a question of structural integrity or electrical integrity. A couple of the ordinances had parking requirements there to provide at least one off-street parking place for somebody at the tower. This is an important one to me. I think the permittee should indemnify the town against lawsuits. If we pass an ordinance and then somebody comes in to put up a tower and the citizen group comes in and sues the town for allowing the tower, the permittee should indemnify us. I think we need to make a statement that the tower cannot interfere with the government emergency response network if we have one. I don't know if we have one. Or any town or county communications. That was in a number of the ordinances. Insurance requirements, they should be in the ordinance. I know that we limit lighting, but we should also make a statement that it needs to comply with the dark sky ordinance. And one other thing, there was a statement made in one of the ordinances that any new developments over a number of acres, I think the number was 65 acres, but this would cover the state ground, that any development over X acres must provide a tower location, which means they would have to set aside a location that's 500 feet from any residentially zoned property. So that's my list.
So the ones that I'd like to see, that I agree with you, are the testing, structural, backup power, parking requirements, indemnification, insurance, lighting, and the acreage or the area for a tower on any new development. And the ones that I can waive on, because I think we're already covered, are paint, color, and finish. I think town codes already take care of that. The graffiti issue is already taken care of. Signage is already taken care of. You have to put emergency signs there, what to do. It has to be padlocked, has to have emergency access. And we don't have a frequency issue, I don't believe, because our fire, life, and law enforcement uses a separate frequency other than cellular frequency. So, but the ones that I would look for support, hopefully, are the ones that I just said, the testing, structural, underground utilities, backup power, parking, indemnification, insurance, lighting, and tower location on any development.
So just on one of those anyway, the lighting, tower shall not be artificially lighted is already in there.
Okay? But yet it still has to have FAA-approved
But,
lighting.
yeah, unless FAA
Okay.
requires.
Okay.
And then our town codes already require the underground of the wires coming and going.
Okay?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Bill?
Go ahead, Phil.
So if a provider was to locate, and I assume on someone's private property, they would own that antenna or that pole. And if there were multiple providers on that pole, who would be responsible for the other providers and what their business is that's being conducted with their equipment on that pole? Does that make sense?
It does. I'm going to try and John, if you'll help me along the way. Generally speaking, there is a builder who designs, engineers, and builds the tower and then leases the provider's space for equipment and their antenna.
And all that's done then usually
Okay.
with the ground lease for whoever the property owner is.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. So
Okay. And
you got different insurance requirements there. You got one for the construction and then one for the provider. So they both have to have that same insurance.
okay, would these providers be typically competitors?
Verizon, they can be. Verizon, T-Mobile, there's a plethora of them, and they all have potential output. But they also, some of them share, and then sell their product out as well. So there's a variety of different arrangements, and we've got to be capable of handling all of them.
So the company or entity that secures the site, builds the pole or installs the pole, and has a lease with perhaps Verizon, would that be like a master lease for Verizon, and they would sublet to other providers, or would each one of those providers lease directly from the owner of the pole?
My understanding is, pardon me, that the builder retains the leases. They're the master leaser, and that they lease the capabilities that they've built for to various entities like Verizon, T-Mobile, and so on.
So, and Phil, I think you asked, and I don't know the answer for sure, but if Verizon has leased a portion of the tower, has some antennas up there, could they then sublease to another provider to share their antennas? I don't know, that probably does happen, but I don't know for a fact.
I'm pretty sure they do, because you've got a third party that is leasing, and say that there's Consumer Cellular, for instance. They use like a T-Mobile and sublease from T-Mobile, and they use their capabilities. So I think that's exactly what happens.
So we would need, as the town, to be protected by the various providers that are on each one of those poles, because if there was a lawsuit, the town would be included in anything that would, in the form of a lawsuit from any of the residents that had that pole on their property.
I think that's correct. I think that you've got a building construction structural indemnification that you're looking for in case the thing falls over, and then you're looking for the tower people that lease it and the providers to make sure that they don't do something that could cause harm to the general public.
So would it not be appropriate then for the town to approve all providers that are on that pole?
I think that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
So,
Oh, okay. I
Vice
just
Chair,
wanted to make sure.
So again, I don't know enough of the details. If Verizon is then, or T-Mobile subleasing now to Consumer Cellular, I'm not sure we would know that piece.
No, but your master lease would say any subsidiaries, any third parties that you would use, that they'd indemnify us on behalf of them.
Right.
I guess my thought process here is always looking at the worst case scenario where there's a problem and one of the providers may be streaming or providing inappropriate activity, for instance, that could cause a town a problem eventually, or even cause all the providers and the town a legal issue. So I don't know if it's worth considering or not. It just comes to mind.
I think that's where the
Things change,
indemnification
this whole
comes from.
technology. Yeah, as long as they're properly insured.
Chair,
Yes,
Chair, Commissioner, I share some of the same sentiment, but I think this all started with Commissioner Kovacevic. You know, we on the build, and so first of all, you go back to you made reference to the community residences, you know, process that we went through, and so on and so forth. And one of the provisions that we had wished to see stipulated within that, in our draft language that we put forward to council, we had insurance criteria in there and hold harmless indemnification language that we wanted from those, in that case, community residence providers, to you know, issue a hold harmless and an additional insured of the town of Fountain Hills, and the town attorney said no dice, you can't do that, and then the majority of the council went with the town attorney and stripped that language out. So I think in this case, I mean, you're kind of apples and apples here. I think you're going to end up in the same spot, different subject matter, but same rules of the road, so to speak. But I think in this case, what I want to add into your conversation there is, if you did a quick Google search on the computer, you go back to June 18th of this year, of 2024, you can find a Cox Communications pole with a bunch of gear hanging from it that got backed into, or it got hit, let's say, by a box truck, and that pole landed in the backyard with that gear landing in a swimming pool that had 5 kids in it. So I want that to be a part of the narrative and the record on this particular insurance provision, because that's a real world example 20 minutes down the road within the last quarter of this calendar year where bad things, luckily none of the kids got injured because the lines for whatever reason weren't energized. But that's a real world example of what could have gone terribly wrong because that pole happened to be in the right of way, by the way, but because that pole, had that adjacency and did in fact cause harm, I think that Tempe could have been, in a little bit of pain because of that.
Thank you. Anything else on commissioners?
So, I mean, these are all some very valid questions. Thank you for doing all that background work. That's pretty solid. So, my question is on the power backup. I never thought, are we talking per pole?
Yes.
And what is the source of energy?
Gas, battery? I do think that John commented that, I'm not positive of this, but I think the FCC requires that there is a consistent supply of power. So it could be propane, LP, could be gas if it's available in the area, little genset. But
What's the industry standard?
Chairman, unfortunately, Commissioner DePaul, I don't know the details of it, but this started, I don't know, half a dozen years ago or so that the FCC did some rulings, and I think they identify certain towers so that there's enough coverage left in an area, and they have to have that backup power, so there's always a system operational. And so I don't know that's required for every tower, but I think there's some percentage of them or some spacing of them that does require that through the FCC.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember offhand exactly, but I remember reading about gensets being required, order of magnitude, depending upon the service entrance coming to the unit.
Right.
Would depend, but it can be whatever uninterruptible power source you need.
Interesting.
Okay. Anything else, commissioners? John, anything else?
I know you've got at least one person hoping maybe to speak a little bit. So I'm going to take. So just to set some expectations a little bit, because you've brought up some of the comparisons with the community residence ordinance. You've thrown out a lot of things. Some of them are easier, some of them may be a little bit harder. I brought back up this intent statement here that we need to balance things with. We have to comply with the TCA and provide reasonable opportunity for service while providing also protection to the public. So maybe some of these things, particularly, as they go back to that map of the 500 feet and what that does and how limiting that is, that we may come back and say that really is too much, and some things like that. But anyway, just want to set that expectation. We'll be looking at that, and whether you keep it at 500 feet, it gets to council. Some things, as we look at the decibel limit, the council has previously decided we're not doing decibel limits anymore. So just again, want to put that out there that this will have that type of continued review. Things may change, but
Understood. Paula?
We have one speaker card for call to the public, Lori Troller.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, Ms. Troller has asked for 6 minutes, plus or minus a couple of seconds.
It's a lot longer now. Ask for 10 minutes. Possible.
Talk fast, please.
Good evening, Chair, Peter, Vice Chair, Mr. Watts, and Commission. Before I start what I was going to present, I do want to say that when Mr. Wesley's presentations are over an hour and a half and the public gets 3 minutes or 6 to respond, is not even adequate. And so I would like to ask for some sort of opportunity for me to provide my insights. I can answer so many of these questions, and there were so many things that need to come into discussion that it would greatly help this process. One thing, you guys were talking about distance, the automatic distance, or 300 or 500 feet. There's one thing that was completely overlooked, is that there is the ADA, and the ADA recognizes a disease that when people are near these towers, they literally can't live near them. They can't be in the presence of it. You've seen April McCormick. She doesn't live here anymore. She had to move because of the exposure in the town. her face will start to fall, like she had a heart attack, she will lose her voice. And this is within 30 minutes of exposure, and it takes her days to recover. This is a very real thing. So when we automatically put a tower up just because it's within 200 feet or 500 feet or whatever your number is, you are ignoring the ADA requirements to notify people. Everyone must know this. So these distances can't just be an automatic thing. There are other laws in place that we will be violating. The PV, you mentioned PV quite a bit, and they're 300 feet. There's a little bit of history to that. PV went into negotiations with several telecom companies, and they agreed that Paradise Valley would define a corridor for all the main towers. And they said, hey, telecom guys, if you promise to keep the majority of your towers in this corridor, we'll let you have the 300 feet. That's why that number's so low. When it came down to actually putting those networks in, telecom companies said, and they put them wherever they want. And now they have a problem. So that's why that's 300 feet is there, because they thought they were going into some sort of agreement with the telecom companies that they didn't live up to. Regarding sound, you guys were talking about sound a lot. So there's the actual tower itself, and then there's this whole conglomerate of little facilities that go around the base of a tower. You can require all that be built underground. Most of that's your noise generation, put it underground. Just make that the requirement. So you can play with that thought. The submittal process that John was talking to, that got glanced over very quickly. There is a lot of information that goes into that. One thing this town needs is a database. When I asked John about previous decisions, approvals or denials of any towers we've had, that process is over 100 questions, and he cannot tell me how he came to an approval or a denial. We need to be able to track that. We need to be able to pull up a map and say, we definitely have this tower here. This is the equipment on here. This is what, when it went in, what it was said to be emitting. So when you do tests later on throughout the year, you can say, hey, these are hey, this number's way low, this number's way high. We need a database. We need to be able to track this stuff. A lot of that information is collected at the point of an application. All that's available. Because when we have staff move on to greener pastures, we lose all that knowledge. That we can't even ask anybody. So we do need a database. That's a whole nother topic. Drive-by tests. Do not use drive-by test. Drive-by test. What notoriously is falsified in court case after court case or drive-by test information. Telecoms constantly lie about that. They just take some sample somewhere, put your street name on it. Oh, that's been proven over and over again. What you really want are drop call logs. That's your information and my information. How many calls did we make and how many calls were dropped? And you need the data behind that. That's the type of information you need. Now, if we don't define that in our ordinance, if we don't define how they are to provide that in a court case, they said, well, you didn't say and you didn't define it, so we don't have to give it to you. We're putting a tower in. So be very specific on what you're looking for when you're looking for what you call gaps. Now, there's another thing. What is a gap? Is a gap 30 feet? I can't make a phone call between here and there. Does that define a gap? It doesn't. So there's all these other definitions of what's a gap. And is that gap there all the time? Is it raining? Do we have gaps all over? Did they take that? Did Telecom go out on a rainy day and take gap information, drive-by test information on a rainy day? Or during the fair, oh, look at this. If they did a test when we were all at the fireworks, they're going to say, we need 19 towers around here. That's not fair. It's not accurate. So all of these things, you've got to nail them down. You can't just say, we need testing. You have to define it. And if we don't define it in a court case, they're going to say, you didn't define it. And so they win cases. So you got to be really specific. And this is why I have been forever saying, you guys need to bring people in. Who here knows how to say what those numbers should be and what's real? This is where the experts come in. This is where their advice will help us. Let's see. I think Peter was speaking about, unless it's written in an ordinance, the industry has complete, Vice Chair Watts was speaking about they turn it up or they turn it down. Well, don't you think we want to know where it's set? And we should always know where it's set. These things are emitting pollution. That's part of the problem. So if this were something we could actually see, an amount of smoke coming out of a building, well, okay, we're going to allow a certain amount of smoke. But if they started just like, unbeknownst to us, just putting out way more smoke on some days and some days none, we can see that. We have a grasp and we can know what that is. We know whether we need to be concerned or not. So when we do not have those volumes measured by these towers, this is invisible pollution. You can kind of tell with your phone, your gaps, So I'm just saying, because you can't see this, doesn't mean you don't measure it and you don't want to know. You do want to know.
Lori, can you wrap up, please?
I didn't even get to my...
It's 8 minutes.
Okay, real quickly. There's a big problem right now is that Mr. Wesley is editing the code. So in Fountain Hills and everywhere else, when we have law, it's written in the form of an ordinance or a resolution. And the difference between those two doesn't matter in this application, so we're not going to get into that. But you guys aren't dealing with a resolution or an ordinance. He's dealing with the municipal code or the zoning code, right? And he told you earlier that you can't touch the piece in the municipal code. And right now, we have a law on the books. It's a resolution, happens to be a resolution, and it's resolution 2018-18. This is what you guys need to be updating. Now what happens is this resolution gets codified. It gets codified into code. And it gets either codified into municipal code or zoning code. So now what Mr. Wesley is working on is Chapter 17, which is the cellular code. You guys aren't touching the broadband. I have never talked about cellular. The council was only ever talking about broadband. Broadband was codified into section 16-2. This is the only piece you guys are working on. You are not touching this. Now, this is code. The only time you touch code is when there's errors to it. These aren't errors. This is a modification to the law. You guys need to be updating the law, not making codification changes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you got your 10 minutes.
Thank you. Felt like 2.
With that, no other speaker cards, Paula? Just the one?
No, Vice Chair.
Okay, with that, we'll close the public part. And commissioners, comments?
I would like to thank Lori. I think, Lori, you've really contributed to our understanding and clearing up some of this stuff for us. Really appreciate it. I would like to know this. I'm interested about this thing she's talking about with putting everything underground. Is there any city with that? Because that's another added thing that we would have to
Are you
add
talking
on
about
to.
the equipment itself?
The equipment
Yeah, it's a
itself.
vault. I mean, think about a vault that you've got, a mechanical room vault with pump stations.
Right.
Okay,
But
same thing.
would that be would that have to be in a conditioned space? Are we not talking about an air conditioner?
Well, if it's outside on a pole, it's not going to be in a conditioned space.
But it's got free airflow.
It does, but you could put ventilation fans in. You could do that. So, I mean, there's ways to build a vault. And I think that's a great idea because that would abate a lot of the noise issues or concerns
Right.
being in a
No,
vault.
I
So
think that
maybe a vault's
is
the way to go.
very, yeah.
I think somebody's going to look at that and say, look, by the time I do acoustical enclosure, distancing and measurement and all that, that a vault may be the way to go. It's underground, out of sight, out of harm's way. So I agree. And I also think that to Mr. Aller's comments about data, I think we've been driving home all evening, the collection, the analysis of data, understanding where the gaps are. Well, we didn't come right out and talk about the data logs themselves. We said we want all of the providers' data. We want them to be able to validate that. What that is, we haven't defined yet, but we have to take that next step and define it. So I agree with that as well. Commissioner Schlossberg, please.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on Commissioner DePauw's comment, and I wanted to thank Lori, not for clearing things up, for making me more confused, as it were. But through this whole process, again, I've not said much because I'm still so confused. Vice Chair Watts has become a semi-expert. Commissioner Kovacevic has learned a lot as well. But I mean, I go back to what Lori said and the fact that we don't have professional help. I've said this before. It's absurd that we're tasked with making a recommendation when I honestly, I mean, maybe a sliver of a percentage of a clue what I'm talking about up here. It's absurd. So I will leave my comments at that, but thank you, Lori. And wow, you could have gone on for a long time.
Any other comments, commissioners? Commissioner Gray and Phil, sorry about this. I am terrible at pronouncing last names.
I'd like to be there, Commissioner, because I got a lot of thoughts about this. I started where Commissioner Schlossberg was. I'm a notch or two away from that position. I'm out of the starting blocks, but I still have a lot to learn. So, I jotted down a bunch of notes. I went back through our old meeting minutes. I went back through council videos. I went back through text messages and emails, and tried to get to a spot tonight where I feel good about something going forward, and I'm not. And so I'm gonna kind of skim my notes here, but I want to read them because I want to remember them, and if for no other reason, the verbatim transcript is going to help me do that. So, I want to be clear. I want what I say to be reflected of me as a resident who has a small family in this town and then a commissioner. That's where I come from on this topic at this point, and I have to say what we've seen transpire on this it's nothing short of unbecoming of government, when our entire interest, what we should be doing here, it should be in the interest of the citizenry of the town and the private property owners of the town. I've had a lot of conversations. I've had a lot of conversations with Lori. I've had a lot of conversations with Rick. I've had a lot of conversations with folks that we deal with tangentially in and around the hospital. They're in the telecommunications industry. And I haven't talked to anybody who hasn't cited some significant concerns with where this industry is going and what the actual product even is today when we start to get into the higher decibel outputs, and that's a total aside from having the conversation. I made reference to the pole, the Cox pole in Tempe that fell. That's another real world example of we gotta play in this at a more macro level than what we're doing here. And we've got to do that with all the right, tools, arrows in our quiver, if you will. So I'm doubling down on the need to review this whole thing holistically and across both sections of code. I am not by any means, I want to be crystal clear, I'm not saying combo the sections of code together. I'm not saying make section 16 go away. I'm just saying, how in the world can we talk about having tower parameters and placements and separation distances on private property when we could just rack them out in the 10-foot right-of-way throughout town? How do you not talk about those two things, as an intermingled topic, and then bifurcate them back out to their respective spots in the code after all of that conversation has happened? So, the reason that hasn't happened is obviously we've been limited by the town council and the town attorney in what our span of scope here is. And I went back and I watched all of that, and if the basis, which is what I think I heard of this limitation, is to save us somehow from preemption, I got to say that's a false notion, because as Commissioner Watts pointed out in his example earlier, we've been preempted before as a commission. Most of this commission was the same commission that was in place, absent, I believe, Commissioner Dempster at the time, that worked through the community residence piece. And so you can't tell me today that you're going to save us from preemption, because we were preempted when that topic came to light as well. And so if it's not preemption, then the basis must be for some sort of special interest, maybe an inadvertent transfer of wealth from private property owners to the town via these small cell agreements that seem to be proliferating throughout the country. Everybody's chasing the 10-minute city, and maybe that's what we're doing here, but nobody's talking about it. We're just saying we can't talk about it. If that is what we're doing, that's not something you do in the dark. That's something that gets daylight, and we have the conversation out in the open. We talk about the property values, we talk about the health consequences, and we weigh this whole thing in a extremely complex and complex deliberation. But you can't talk about placement here on private property versus placement in the right of way. You got to talk about the whole thing holistically. So I got a note here, about John. John, I really, really, really don't envy the position you're in, and I want to be really clear that what I'm saying, my thoughts here, they have no reflection on you or staff in general. I've got a tremendous amount of respect for your position, and I absolutely recognize that you're obligated to take this direction and work with the tools that the council affords you to the best of your ability. And I absolutely think that's what you've done. I just, again, think our span of control here is misguided. So I guess in my opinion, again, and having observed, I've come to this revelation that when the council removed most of the meat of consideration from the topic, it was incorrect, and I believe that compromises this commission's ability to make that meaningful recommendation tonight or at any time, or at least a recommendation that would holistically benefit the community and residents. I go a little bit further and say I think this approach actually does a disservice. I think it does a disservice to the town. I think it does a disservice to the residents. As we make a recommendation, if we make a recommendation tonight to Chapter 17 in isolation, it insinuates that we've addressed the topic. And I know John said at the onset, we might pick up the other part of this at a later point in time, but I don't think you can do them in isolation. I've belabored that, I guess, to this point. I don't think addressing Chapter 17 in isolation does anything. I think it insinuates we've addressed the topic, but we've actually done nothing more than placate it. So that to me is kind of on par with, we become complicit in the narrative of, let's move on. There's nothing here. And I think this commission has shown over time that we've got a little more integrity to display, to those that we deliberate on behalf of. I wrote down 6 points in time that are really interesting to me. That again, I want this all in one spot. So the first point in time is, how did this whole thing start? And that was after an extended series of calls to the public, or open calls to the public. The council requested staff on board the consultant to facilitate a review and recommendation of ordinances related to towers in the general context of small cell distribution and broadband. 2 consultants were hired by the town. Contracts were executed by the town attorney, somehow as signatory. And then my second point in time is the scope of work for the Campanelli agreement was obtained through a FOIA by a resident. And that scope of work very clearly states review and updates of Chapter 16 and 17 of Town Code and Ordinances. And I have to note here that agreement was received in full and it was unredacted. The second consultant, whose business is centered around negotiation of contracts between public entities and tower operators, was then hired. The third point in time is the town runs out the clock on the Campanelli retainer, releases the consultant through a lengthy and puzzling process run through the town attorney. Next point in time is the scope of work that this commission is tasked with is quietly modified by the council behind closed doors in executive session, and we're told only have eyes for Chapter 17, and the Campanelli documents are placed into privileged and confidential status now by the town attorney. And then finally, and the most impactful of my 6 points in time here, is when the gun starts to really smoke. And that's when another FOIA request is made by a second resident for the very same Campanelli agreement after the May Zoning Commission meeting. And that agreement was passed on to me. And would you believe that agreement was now fully redacted? There was not one word in the scope of service for Andrew Campanelli that wasn't fully redacted. And so I end up saying, what in the world is going on here? And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but after you direct us, we hire consultants, we go through review, we let agreements expire, we fire, or maybe I should say not retain a consultant, we pivot, and then we redact, all behind closed doors when we're quite literally talking about ordinance development. Even I am going to begin to wonder what is going on here. The commission, John, members of the public, Lori, you in particular, have arguably hundreds of hours invested in this topic. The commission finally stumbled on the realization back in May that the gap and most of our confusion, or I should say most of my confusion, and what we sought to accomplish was actually in Chapter 16 and not 17, which we had been told to put the blinders on for. But in retrospect, I guess that really shouldn't surprise me. This commission, we're not always on the same page all the time, but what you can always say about this commission is that good things come from debate, good things come from research, good things come from the debate on that research, and good things come from the public participation. To roll over or turn around, everybody says it's preempted or don't look here, would be a dereliction of duty of this commission. And that's why we hung it all out there back in May and made the very specific request. And the request was 2 parts. The request was, A, we'd like to look at 16 and 17. We never said we wanted to combo them. We said we'd like to look at them. And maybe tangentially we said the word combo. But if you go back and look at those minutes, it very specifically says, look at Chapter 16 and 17. And the other request that we made is, we made the request to understand why. And we made that request, and we said we'd take that request under admonishment in executive session or publicly, but we made that request. We never got it. The following morning, though, we got an email from the town attorney saying, it's not going to happen. Present your findings without delay. The clock's ticking, essentially. That was long before John had ever even posed the question to the council And that gets flagged as A, noted, because we got the correspondence, and B, odd by all accounts, because we never asked the attorney's permission. We asked the council, but we were told within 24 hours to move along by the attorney. Once it got to the council, we got the public lectures from the council on the rule of law, insubordination, protection of staff, trust what you can't see, trust what's behind the curtain, and of course a few amusing analogies with respect to our collective skill sets. But we still never got that logical explanation that passed the bar. And ironically, only council persons Friedel, Toth, and Skillercorn ever reached out to the commission to understand the basis of a request. If we were paid employees, I'd say I get it, but we're not. We're a cross-section of volunteer residents with a singular objective of protecting the residents and the residents' investments in this town. We absolutely recognize we don't make policy or law, but we sure as heck have the ability to recommend and an obligation to do that to the best of our ability. So, when you leave the commission in the dark, you start to hypothesize why. So here they are. Door number one, Andrew Campanelli is wildly incompetent, maybe even dangerous, and the town attorney gave him grace and a swift and quiet termination. I would buy this door, except we know that several other public entities here in Arizona and across the nation are utilizing the consultant to draft ordinances to protect their residents and investments. We have no idea what was ever in it. John did a nice job tonight of telling us where there were gaps in that ordinance, and maybe those are gaps we would plug, maybe they weren't, but that's door number one. Door number two, the second consultant's onboarded. This consultant specializes in lease agreements between providers and municipality. He inadvertently or indirectly makes a sales pitch, and the town sees dollar signs. The conundrum with door number two is those dollar signs, if not managed, are at the expense of the average citizen from a number of angles, predominantly property values and health. And that is not appropriate without us at least having a conversation. Door number three, the commission is the same commission that presented the community residence ordinance to the council for a vote. As Commissioner Watts had outlined earlier, when we went through that process, we were repeatedly told that the Prescott model was the only model. We were told you can't, it's protected, it's untouchable, ADA, Affordable or Fair Housing Act, and my favorite, it's preempted. But in the end, the creation of that ordinance should be a very good reference for what can come of challenging perceived boundaries. This commission had the fortitude at that time to say thanks for the advice, to walk away. However, we said at that time we're not going to run and hide. We rather presented the language that's on the books today by all accounts, and that language has curtailed the number of homes converted to high occupancy dormitories and has become a model ordinance for municipalities nationally that does it for all the right reasons. It promotes the types of homes when they're set up for the right reasons, and it discourages the types of homes when they're set up as profit centers for corporations to the detriment of neighborhoods. The result of this a couple of years later is the number of homes is down significantly in Fountain Hills from the trajectory we were on. I view that as a success on behalf of the residents, and there might be a little bit of I'll say retribution is not the right word, but I'll use it anyway. There might be a little bit of retribution today because we didn't listen when we were told there's nothing you can do in this space, look elsewhere. So I'll wrap up here. I suppose special interest and personal interest could be in the mix, but I'm more inclined to believe it's a combination of doors 2 and 3, where town leadership has probably been pitched a potential financial gain through leases of right-of-way in folks' front yards in exchange for property values and health, through the town attorney who promotes a zero-risk mentality, which, in my way of thinking, benefits the attorney and his firm for making the next sales pitch to the next municipality for services. However, the downside here to us and to the town is that the zero-risk approach is paid for indirectly by the residents when we say we can't or we'll get sued over time. I have a really hard time with this strategy. So, ultimately, what do we do now? Do we take Chapter 17 in isolation? Do we punch it through tonight as we've been requested to do, to be in conformance with code and with all of the questions and the red lines that that were flushed here tonight, or do we look at a path that is not often traveled? Frankly, I don't think we've ever traveled it, and say we're missing critical span of control to make any meaningful recommendation to the council, and we should simply defer. So if I was to make a motion, and I want to talk about this, but if I was to make a motion this evening, it would be to say the work on Chapter 17 has been great, but we would be making a mistake to put anything forward on Chapter 17 without at least taking a hard look at Chapter 16. Preemption or not, I think that we can find a way to look at Chapter 16, and at least, the very least that comes of that is we say, we looked, we tried, we couldn't find a way. I guarantee you we'll find a way to do something impactful and meaningful to the residences and the property owners of this town if those restrictors are taken off of us and we can look at both of them. So my motion would be to park what's been done on Chapter 17 and effectively forward a recommendation to the council of, quote unquote, no recommendation until such time the council affords the commission the latitude to review and recommend modifications to all facets of towers, their placement across Chapter 16 and Chapter 17. I think we owe it to everybody in this town and every resident who could be affected at some point in the future by a right-of-way placement of a tower to say we actually looked at. So in closing, while we might say preempted, I think we should once again say, that's great, but let's go ahead and take a look at the topic anyway and see if we can't affect some meaningful change. And so Commissioner, Chair, I'll turn that back to you.
Any other comments from commissioners?
You still awake?
Yep, still awake. So
This is Phil again, Phil Savion. Again, uneducated for the most part with this. I couldn't agree I couldn't agree more with Peter with his conclusions. I heard some great information tonight from commissioners that have been on top of this for months. Lori, your presentation, every time I've seen it and heard it, you're a great asset to the town on this topic. And John, you do have an impossible job. I think I'd like to see us follow Peter's advice and park it for the time being and try to figure out what the town really wants out of this and how we can go about helping it accomplish that. Thank you.
Commissioner DuPont?
Yeah, I also concur with what Chairman Gray is talking about, and if he presented a resolution, I will second that.
In addition to what Commissioner Gray said, I think we got a huge amount of additional data this evening, a huge amount of open-ended questions that we don't have answers to, and a whole heck of a lot more research. And I don't think that we can do the research sufficiently without all of the information, just like any other trade. And I don't care whether it is a framing contractor, that he needs his hammers and saws. We need information. That is what will give us the ability to provide a very succinct, accurate, protective ordinance. Without the information, I think we're dead in the water. And so I appreciate all the kind words from Commissioner Gray. And Commissioner Gray, did you actually make a motion, or you intend to, or what do you want to do?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, my motion is really simple. It's unconventional, but it's simple. There's great work on the table. I'll say this part again. John has done a tremendous job of getting us to this far with essentially what I view as 2 hands and 1 foot tied behind his back. And we're fumbling along as best we can, largely led by you, Commissioner Watts, and a lot of the intel and research of Ms. Troller. I got to say, I can't follow 70% of it. I try. But we can't do this like this. I don't care what anybody says. We can't. I'm not going to be a part of being told that I have to put blinders on like I'm going into the stall number 5 in the Derby and I'm not supposed to look left or right. That's not how you develop the best possible product for the citizenry. Now, if there's another objective, by all means, let's talk about it. But let's sanitize that out in public, in daylight. Let's not hold that in the back room because we're talking about ordinance development here. And so we either look at this topic holistically across both the public and the private space, or we just wait until such time that we, the town as a body, is willing to take that angle on it, because whatever we do tonight, whatever we do in isolation with Chapter 17 will have an impact or will be impacted by whatever happens within Chapter 16. And God knows if we don't touch Chapter 16, then it's preemption, preemption, preemption. Don't touch it. They can do whatever they want. And I'll say it one more time. That's exactly what we were told. The community residences and what we have, what we came out of that. I don't think anybody fathomed we could have come out of that process with that. But we did, between John, between public input, between our Mrs. Bell, all of the research that happened and the collaboration on that resulted in something really special. And so why the hell wouldn't we try to do the same here? And so my recommendation, because we're up against the timeline and the mandate, my recommendation is to forward a recommendation of no recommendation tonight. And again, solicit the approval to broach into, to unveil Chapter 16, look at the whole thing holistically, and then recompartmentalize it like adults into their respective chapters of code so we don't screw up the system.
Do I have a second on the motion?
Yes, I will second that motion.
Commissioner DePauw seconds. And one other comment that I want to make sure the commissioners understand, because we have a timeline that we have to deal with as well. To John's point during the presentation, we could possibly have a special meeting in, I'm not sure when that would be, John, August? Early August, later July?
Before the 12th.
Vice Chair, it would have to be before July 12th, or August 12th.
August 12th.
Okay. So we may put ourselves in that position, so just everybody is aware. So with that said, Paula, can I have a roll? Oh, hang on 1 second, Commissioner Kovacevic.
So I don't have my arms around what we're doing. So we're saying no recommendation because we don't feel we can rule on antennas without ruling on the small cell right-of-way broadband part covered in Chapter 6 in Section 16.
I think that's part of it. I also think that it is because of the complexity of right-of-ways versus private property, public property. Without all that information and without the technical and legal expertise to be able to answer all the questions that we've got in front of us tonight, that we're going to defer. Paula, roll call, please.
Commissioner Corey,
Aye.
Commissioner DePauw,
Aye.
Commissioner Kovacevic,
Aye.
Commissioner Schlossberg,
Aye.
Commissioner Sevim,
Aye.
Vice Chair Watts,
Aye.
Chair Gray.
Aye.
7-0.
And with that, we'll move to item number 6, commission discussion request for research. Anybody have any topics that would like John and staff to address, other than? Thought you had to go.
I couldn't leave.
Okay. I'm still hammering on bicycles and pedestrians, so don't lose sight of that one. Without any comments, we'll go to 7, summary for commission requests from John.
I heard bicycles and pedestrians. That's my summary.
Yeah. The bicycle and pedestrians is safety. It goes back to people walking out, and this weekend, people walked out in the middle of the crosswalk at the Avenue of the Fountains in Saguaro, didn't look, almost got run over, somebody making a turn because they thought they owned it. Same thing has happened at the roundabout several times where people have walked out, and bicyclists blowing through stop signs, blowing through red lights. I know MCSO, the law enforcement, is primary on vehicles, safety, but at some point, I'd like to talk about bicycles and pedestrians.
That gets us number 8 on the agenda?
I don't want it on the agenda, I just want to note it.
Right. So, in terms of my report, August meeting, at this point, it looks like you will likely have 2 special use permit applications for consideration and 1 ordinance text amendment.
Okay. That's it? An easy August.
Should be.
Should be.
Maybe.
So we are meeting in August.
Yes, you got 3 items.
Yep. And I think with that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Wow, that was quick. So that's unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.